Hi, welcome to episode 48 of Startup Strides. Today, my guest is Devika Thapar. She is co-founder and COO of Wilbe. Welcome, Devika.
Hey, Javed, good to be here, and really hoping that the Wi-Fi sticks.
I'm hoping too, because I've been looking forward to making this episode. I think what you guys are doing extremely cool. I have a lot of questions to go through. Hopefully, we have enough time left to
Yes,
finish everything. I guess before we dive into well-being and what you guys are doing with deep tech investing, I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself. Tell us about your background and I guess what shaped and what experiences shaped your thinking about entrepreneurship and investment.
yeah. Ooh, I well, had you asked me, 20 years ago, would I see myself doing this? The answer is no. So it's pure serendipity that we've somehow found ourselves working with, some of the smartest people on a daily basis. I grew up in India and did economics for my undergrad. Wanted to go into the development world, but then I think was perhaps rightfully told in retrospect that I won't be able to make a living through that. So I joined by my parents. So I joined the world of management consulting, which quickly gets quite boring in a few years, and always had a plan to move to the US to study. So I couldn't do it during my undergrad. So I said, let's do it for my master's, and found myself doing my MBA at Yale. And I think that was the spark that kind of started in terms of got introduced to this whole world of deep tech and frontier science and academia and how commercialization works. So with some of my colleagues, we were running the entrepreneurship club, and they were far more technical than me, and they said, hey, right down the road is this thing called the tech transfer office. We should spend time with them and see if there's interesting IP and research that's coming out of Yale, and maybe we could join forces and form spinouts. So I had no idea what any of that meant, but I was like, sounds cool. I'm interested in entrepreneurship. Part of my family runs their own it's a family owned business. So I think that I've had a partial lens into that world, but didn't quite know what that journey would look like for me. So when they said this could be an opportunity, we kind of jumped right in. And then we set up a program where we, as MBA students, a few of us were evaluating faculty and IP that were thinking of spinning out. And I think that was quite eye opening for me. One, because I had no idea that we were working on such fascinating things like facial recognition. This was 2011, and some very cool things in RNA technology, even before it's become, as in the mainstream, if you like, of bio as it has today. But then I also recognized that perhaps the MBA pairing with the scientist is not necessarily the ideal one, and may not produce the value that we were actually genuinely looking to produce. So I kind of paused there, but got very interested in the AI space. And so when IBM Watson came along, they were recruiting on campus. So I was like, wow, this sounds fascinating. I enjoyed doing some work on facial recognition. So I said this would be a great organization to be a part of, and ended up spending 5 years with them in New York, and then also in initially in kind of a sales and BD role, because I didn't get my visa in the US, so I landed in London. Those were the only roles in the organization that were feasible, but kept feeling that I needed to get closer to the product because I wasn't quite sure what I was selling, and so landed up back in the mothership, which was in the US, to only realize that I don't know if anyone was really sure they were selling. So I think there was a bit of a disconnect between R&D and product and sales, which, as you like, it happens in large organizations, and especially in organizations that are over 100 years old, which made me kind of realize that perhaps, big tech and legacy tech is not necessarily the right space for true innovation and entrepreneurial innovation to happen versus, doing things at a grassroots level. So by then I had, because I had spent time between London and New York, I had met my now co-founder and partner, Ali, and he was very much working with founders. He was a former lawyer, quit his practice to basically become a very cheap lawyer, an unregulated lawyer for startups, rolling up his sleeves and basically being the legal guy, the business guy for founders who were spinning out of Yale, Imperial. And so offline, I started doing that and getting better visibility into the startup ecosystems in the UK, also a bit in the US. And eventually that kind of led to this big realization that a lot of the hard problems are going to be solved this century through science. And the missing piece in the whole commercialization playbook to date has been a focus on the wrong asset. We've been focusing on the IP, but not on the human behind the IP. And if we can unlock scientists and give them agency on understanding what does that path of commercialization look like and how can you actually translate this to create impact in the real world, then we're going to see far more things being built at scale and far more innovation happening and far more impact taking place as well. That central focus on the scientist as the leader, the scientist as the CEO, was, if you like, the starting premise for Wilbe. And this was, I think, thought of in 2019, but really crystallized by the end of 2020, and then kind of incorporated probably early 31st of December 2020.
I was going to ask a question. You kind of answered it. I was going to ask, you and your co-founder, you mentioned that you don't come from science background, you come from economics background, your co-founder. And I was going to ask, how do you get to decide and evaluate very hard deep tech, which requires a lot of like deep science back. But then you said there's a shift from asset to different kind of asset, which is a human, focusing on the founder and just giving them kind of like letting them do the fly essentially, right? And just giving them the opportunities for that, not the focusing deeply on the science itself, but focusing on the human behind it essentially. Is that?
Yeah, very much.
Fair.
I think you're at the earliest of stages, and the only thing that matters in actually translating something that's very complex and very technical and rooted in science is if you can execute and do it with speed so that you can create it into something that makes sense in the commercial world. And a lot of that boils down to understanding if the person in charge can actually understand how to do it and can also do it as well, which always, I mean, just like in many startups, the team is the thing that matters most at the start. I think it's the same for science. So for us, when we spend time with researchers, I think the first layer of even understanding if this has legs in the real world as a business is, can we understand what you're doing?
Mm.
And can you communicate clearly what you're doing? Can you break it down? Can you break down something as complex as sensory computing to us or fusion to us? And if you can, then already the biggest hurdle that can be crossed in terms of seeing if we can then take it a layer deeper and make it real.
I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, Richard Feynman who said it's not the person who can speak abstractly and with complex jargon that understands the subject well. It's the person that can break it down to like a 5-year-old that knows the subject well. So I guess, what you're saying is like somebody who can translate their complex science to the general audience is the one you can actually create something that's right.
Yeah.
I was looking at Wilbe. It's quite different, right? It's not your accelerator. It's not the VC fund. It's a full stack venture firm for scientists, right? I guess I'm curious, what does that mean in practice? And of the capital, lab space, community, and education, which layer do you think is a true unlock?
That is a great question. It's almost a question like what our LPs ask us, Javed. So
I don't have the money to be LP, but thank you.
yeah, do you want to LP? I'd say one thing is that the answer is a lot clearer today than perhaps it was when we started. I think when we started, we felt quite strongly that we need to unlock all on an equal footing in order to build the full stack, if you like. So in that sense, yes, it is a different kind of a venture firm, because when we started, we said, we're going to solve all the crucial bottlenecks that scientists face, because only if we do that can we truly create a centralizing ecosystem for scientists. And albeit we're still very young in our journey, but I think even in the 4 to 5 years that we're coming up to being around, that has helped us a lot in creating a trusted community of scientists, a very deep know-how on what does it take to build a high-performing company right at the what are the different levers in the world of science commercialization that also need to happen in order for the ecosystem to be strong. So not every scientist is going to be a founder. So, what happens when the scientist decides to continue being a PI? Would they be a different kind of a PI and create a whole new generation of research that could also potentially be translated in the real world? And what about those that end up becoming founding team members? So kind of diving into that's the education realm, if you like. And then on the other extreme, it's physical space. Scientists need lab spaces in order to get started. And the market itself has changed a lot in the past few years. But I remember when we started, there was no lab space for a pre-seed company. This very, very hard for them unless they kind of just took on a warehouse and refitted it and built a wet lab or a hardware lab themselves, which is essentially one big part of the business for Wilbe Lab as well. So I think they all have been a big unlock, and then putting the capital hat on is, if the ultimate goal is how do we translate more science effectively, how can we make more moonshots into reality, then the true unlock remains the scientist, finding the scientist who can actually do it, and then giving them all the support that they need. So capital is arguably a great lever, but I think at the stage we operate in, capital without making sure that you are prepared is of no use. And I think that's also why we started teaching or equipping scientists with business know-how, is because when we kept seeing companies, deeply technical companies emerging from universities in particular, or from any first-time founder, we were seeing a common pattern of expensive mistakes that were being made. That expensive mistake could be, you haven't really thought through the cap table for the company. So you really haven't thought through what the right team for this company should be. You've arbitrarily given, practically half the company to a random business development person who is probably not the right fit for the company right now, but might be a fit further down the line when there is something to sell, if you like. But right now, the main thing is, how do we de-risk, and how do we get on board the right stakeholders to support us while we de-risk the science and the engineering, if you like, or tech transfer. How do we make sure that we're not giving up a whole unnecessary terms to the university, customer validation? So those are the things that often, if you get right from level zero, it's then much easier to build something that can stick. And I think that's what we enjoy doing the most versus pure capital investing. So for us, it's we'll spend time with lots of scientists. There'll be some that we fit the venture capital mold, and there'll be some that also have that ambition and have what it takes to wear the science and the business hat truly. And we'll spend as much time as we can to make sure that we prepare the company and put the company in the best position possible so that we can fly after that. And that's when the capital comes in, if you like.
I actually have questions about the founder archetype and also the tech investment itself, because it's a very specific type of investment, right? You have a lot of initial upfront investment. You can just easily pivot like in software, right? So I have a question about that. But before I ask, I'm curious about, I've looked into it myself, but for our viewers, for our audience, what are some exciting startups in your portfolio and right now, and which deep tech subsectors are you most excited about in the next 5, 10, 15 years? Proximate Fusion is definitely one of them that it's huge in your portfolio, but there are other ones too. So
yes. Yeah, of course, Proxima, it's hard for anyone not to be excited by the mission they're on. We were in there, spent a day or two with them earlier in July, and it was just amazing to see physically what's coming to shape with that company. I know you know Apoha as well, and obviously huge fans. These are all companies that we've incorporated together and been with the guys. Actually, the Apoha was our first investment.
Oh, really?
Our very first one. And I guess one that I will share, and which is also ties to your second question of what areas are you guys excited about, is Uploid. Have you come across?
I've had Uploid on my Jordan. I've had him on my podcast. He's a fascinating person. Very, very smart individual. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, good. Then like a lot of the Wilbe founders. So, I mean, they're tackling the space of reproductive health. Reproductive health, women's health, both are spaces that have been largely overlooked from a science perspective. And there's a huge need as well in terms of how do we address this growing demand for the change in the reproductive cycle of humans and of parents. So Euploid is trying to essentially reverse the aging of women's eggs to that of a woman who's a lot who would probably be a lot younger, which in science you're saying rejuvenating eggs. And if we're able to do that scientifically and commercially as well, then that's a game changer for improving the success rates of IVF. Similar to that, which is in reproductive health and in women's health, there's a recent company that we have backed, which we can't announce as yet, but they're doing they've had some incredible breakthroughs in tissue level biology, which is not necessarily the most looked into space in terms of actually creating compelling companies out of it. But if you look at problems like endometriosis, which arguably also is a tissue level disease, apart from looking at it from another lens, then if we can regrow tissue and figure out how to regrow it, then that could have a huge impact on any tissue related uh, disease. I think the founders who are building this company are also thinking about building it in quite a creative way, which is we're not just solving this one problem, which arguably no one has solved for, which is endometriosis. So it's a large problem. But we want to build an R&D engine that can that can continue spinning out multiple breakthroughs, but with an eye for translation into one indication, but also multiple indications. So I think that creativity or that ability to build a true platform that's doing continuous R&D and continuous commercialization is very exciting for us. That's on the bio side. Um, and then on the well, I'll pause there because you might have another question.
Well, first of all, huge fan of Jordan. And speaking of endometriosis, I think one of the earliest episodes I've done was I haven't talked to her in a while. I should probably reach out. Her startup was Endocare Therapeutics, as they were developing. As they didn't raise VC funding because they were de-risking with grants,
Okay.
and they were developing a non-surgical way, like sort of biomarker diagnostics method for endometriosis, which is a huge problem. That's where I truly understand the extent of like the
Nice.
need for women's health innovation, right? Maybe I can even at some point I should reach out to her at some point again.
Yeah.
But I guess the question I want to kind of bring it back to investing itself. It requires like deep tech investing requires a different kind of mindset from software and consumer tech, right? Just the timelines, the size of the investment. I guess I'm curious, like across Apoha, Proxima, Uploid, Expression Edit, what's the connecting theme you're actually selecting for? Like, definitely the person is one of them, but other than that, besides the team and the founders, what other things you're actually selecting for, looking for?
Honestly, the team is the biggest the biggest piece. It carries so much weight in our decision making that without it we wouldn't progress. Even if the science was in place and the market was huge, we wouldn't progress if the team wasn't in place. So I think traditional folks that invest in science would say, okay, IP first, then market, and then a team, and we kind of flip it and say team, market, and then science. So if you set the team aside, I think the other big piece we look for is the timing right for this invention or for this breakthrough or for this research to actually exist in the market, because timing for very hard and complex areas makes a huge difference of whether you can ride the momentum in raising the amount of capital that's needed, bringing on board all the stakeholders that's needed in order to solve for the problem. So, and sometimes that's hard to read, but I think and we could also be wrong as well. Who knows? Time will. But if you like, when we backed Proxima, Uploid, Apoha, a lot of these spaces were not markets at the time. So, fusion, I think when we're looking at it in the US had gained traction, but in Europe, I think Germany was still shutting down nuclear reactors when we said, okay, we want to back this team and want to spend time with them. And likewise, when we met Alex, who's Jordan's co-founder and CSO for Uploid, fertility was, a taboo. No one really talks about fertility. It's not a subject that's spoken about. And same for Apoha. I remember when we shared it with a few investors and they were like, this looks like, magic dust. It's not gonna work. I don't think we'd even cross the inflection point of AI the way we have today at the time. Signals, if you like, in trying to understand the markets versus pure scientific progress, if you like.
Sorry, I really want to ask one question because about the timing thing, it's such a fascinating concept, right? Like your timing has been more or less very much on point with Proxima. You deployed, I think recently conceivable life sciences. They raised like 50 million Series A or something. So there's a traction, and
Yeah,
the timing is just. I don't think there's just science behind timing, right? If there was science behind it, everybody would be rich, and
true.
so it's more or less like intuition. So I'm curious, how do you manage to refine and shape your intuition?
You should definitely chat with Ale, my co-founder, for this. He's a great one. I think he's probably seen all of YouTube. You could say that forms his intuition on what we haven't really spent time trying to encapsulate the how behind it. I
Mhm.
think one exercise that we do with our founder, with every founder that we're spending time with, uh, really, and some have it inbuilt, and
Mhm.
some just require a little nudge, but so technically they all have it inbuilt, but it's just the exercise of sparring with each other
Mhm.
is, you know, if you had all the money in the world today,
Mhm.
how would you build this company? And
Mhm.
that really helps inspire in a practical way the use cases that one wouldn't think about ordinarily, and also inspires a narrative that one wouldn't ordinarily think about. And I think that in turn sparks creativity in terms to help visualize, could this actually be something that we'll see in society 10 years from now? But all this, I'll obviously caveat this by saying, who knows, like we're only like from a fund perspective, we're only 3 years in.
Yeah.
And so who knows, suddenly we can wake up tomorrow and we could be totally wrong about all of these things.
Early stage deep tech, sort of, when I was looking at some papers about it struggles with the value of death, right? Between lab and market. And obviously you said the team is really important, the market is really important, but obviously the science is also important too. I mean, if the science is not valid and strong, it's not going to go anywhere.
Yeah.
How do you evaluate whether technology is truly de-risked enough to scale? Are there like certain frameworks or validation models you look for?
Yeah. We've used quite a simple one, which is, you know, is there, is there some degree of commercial validation that this is going to be used once it's reached that level of being able to in the form of a prototype or even in the form of a pilot. Hard to do when you're doing something like fusion, because there you can't really get a pilot until you build
Mhm.
a reactor. But so I think in complex cases like that, you you know, you have to do your best to understand whether the credibility of the research and where the research is coming from is strong enough. So we've been actively researching, spending time in several talent ecosystems across Europe and the US as well, to truly understand, where is there talent that wants to move beyond fundamental science and is doing applied science and actually wants to take that outside of the lab. So through that, I think we also understand where entrepreneurial pools of scientific talent come from, and uh, it just so happens that a lot of it comes from some of the best institutions
Mhm.
where there's a very high fidelity of the science that goes behind their work.
Got it. You look at, since you're full stack venture firm, you look at everything from the founders to the market to the team to providing lab space and everything. And being in the space for a few years now, at least, what do you think is the biggest, the most, actually, the most underestimated kind of bottleneck in taking deep tech from lab to market? Is it the talent? Is it the capital? Is it the regulation, infrastructure, or something else?
I think at scale, capital still remains a
Mhm.
bottleneck. So I think once you get to Series A and beyond, capital is still a bottleneck in Europe, undoubtedly. There are very few firms that do deep tech, most importantly, and B can support a company beyond a series at Series A and beyond Series A. And I think talent is phenomenal. It's phenomenal, and frankly, if you're building something global from the outset, then you'll be able to attract talent from around from around the world. So that's what Proxima has done, that's what Apoha has done, that's what Uploid's done, as his expression edits. So I would say capital still remains a bottleneck. I think there's some degree of, and this is so dependent on the sector, whether it's bio or non-bio, right? I mean, bio has its own threshold of bottlenecks, which is a broader industry problem that needs to be broken in terms of trials and how you do trials quicker, and different regulatory bodies as well.
I guess if I could ask if you could implement one change, it was like wake up next day and implement one Europe-wide change, whether it's a policy change or a capital market change tomorrow to improve Europe's lab-to-market engine, what would it be?
I think less reliance on state funding and more reliance on markets, if you like. That's probably a very broad statement.
That makes sense, though.
But sometimes, state funding can also slow down progress, if you like, or breed perhaps not, doesn't breed the same incentives of how free markets work, which is on performance. So that's, state funding to startups at early stages. And I think state funding becomes extremely relevant later on, especially when you're building things like fusion reactors. You definitely need a whole amount of state funding. But at the early stages, an over-reliance on grants, versus private capital, depending on where you're at with the company, is not necessarily the best way of seeking validation for a company. And then state funding of VCs as well. There's a lot of that as well. It'd be better off if, I think there's some pension reform that's been in the works of saying how can you release some of that in order to back VC funds like the US does.
Very interesting. So I guess there's a lot of things we can copy from US. I'm curious, and it's a bit of an interesting question, I guess, to me. Is there anything you think we shouldn't copy from US when it comes to deep tech startups?
I'm glad you said deep tech startups, because if it was not deep tech, there would be a lot of same respect for having lived there for a bunch of years and also having a lot of co-investors and LPs from there. I think the US still leads when it comes to anything venture and innovation, which we all know. You said anything we wouldn't,
I guess, shouldn't or copy. I guess it's there's different mentalities around how to build a startup, how to raise capital, et cetera, et cetera. So I was curious, by kind of having foot in both ecosystems in one way or another, do you see anything that you're like, maybe we shouldn't do that in Europe?
Really, I think if anything, I think the European ecosystem, we just need more, and it's happening now because it's still a younger ecosystem compared to the US. We just need more founders who are kind of going through the whole cycle and then coming back and building new companies or supporting the next generation of founders and next generation of funds. We just need more of that. So, more risk and, and more high conviction based building of companies and investing in companies or investing in funds. And the US just is a more mature ecosystem. So therefore it has lots more of it. So hopefully we see that for Europe in the next decade.
I'm mindful of our time, so I'm going to ask one final question. For scientists considering entrepreneurship, what's your biggest piece of advice?
Join Wilbe. I mean, we've literally put our whole playbook of what it means to explore and build a company into a very thoughtfully laid out digital process with weekly office hours with the team. So if you're, if you're thinking about it or actively building or even looking to raise a round or close a round, then you should go through BSF. It can take anywhere from 3 days with speed or to 4 weeks.
Well, Devika, it was a lovely episode. Thank you so much for your time and for your points and thoughts and insights. And with the hopes of remaining in touch.
Yes, likewise. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.